Why did no one notice her at first? The answer was simple. She didn't look like she belonged. At sniper evaluation field, the filter, as soldiers called it, every new arrival carried themselves like they were carved out of stone. Square jaws, squared shoulders, boots that had seen combat zones from to helmet. Men who wore their scars like trophies and their confidence like armor. But the woman slipping through the side gate that morning, she looked almost ordinary. Blue jeans, a plain beige shirt, hair tied back in a loose ponytail. No uniform, no rifle case, just a small backpack. The kind of figure you'd expect at a family picnic, not on the most brutal proving ground in the military. And yet she walked like she belonged. The filter itself was more than a range. It was a machine designed to break human beings. 8 days of relentless testing under the Nevada sun, endless obstacle courses, sleep deprivation, long hours of staring through scopes at targets that stretched past the horizon. 70% washed out, some of them crying, some too broken to even look back. The instructors prided themselves on it. This was their kingdom, and failure was its blood. That morning, Major Richards delivered his speech as he always did, sharp, cruel, precise. Look left, look right. By the end of the week, 2 of the 3 of you will be gone. His voice was a hammer striking steel. He fed on their silence, their tightening jaws, their invisible doubt. None of them noticed her at first. It was a junior technician, some kid barely 20, who saw her first. She didn't pause, didn't hesitate. She just kept walking, each step calm, deliberate. The kind of walk that didn't ask for permission. Sergeant caught sight of her next. He turned, his lip curling with irritation. "Ma'am," he called out, sharp enough to snap heads around. "This is a restricted facility. The family observation area is back at base." The laughter started small, rolling through the rows of men like a low wave. The way she stood there, unflinching, only made it worse. She didn't snap back, didn't frown. She just smiled, calm, polite, with something hidden behind it. "I'm here for the evaluation." Barked out a laugh. "The evaluation? Honey, this isn't a carnival shooting gallery. This is the filter." He gestured to the men in rigid lines. "These are the best shooters the military has to offer. This is no place for," he stopped himself, smirk deepening, "no place for tourists." The laughter grew. But her smile didn't falter. If anything, it seemed to sharpen. That subtle curve of her lips carried something that made a few men shift on their boots without knowing why. Richard saw the disturbance and stormed over, his scowl darkening. "What seems to be the problem, Sergeant?" "She says she's here for the evaluation, sir," said, grin spreading. Richards turned his gaze on her, towering over her by a head. "Is this some kind of joke? Are you lost, miss?" He dragged out the word like a blade. "This isn't a place for civilians playing soldier. We're training warriors, not weekend shooters." Every word was meant to cut. Every smirk from the men was salt in the wound. But her eyes, blue-gray, steady as stone, never broke. She let them laugh, let them dismiss her. She just stood there waiting. Finally she spoke again. Langley, there should be an authorization." Even the instructors chuckled at that one. Richards folded his arms, voice sharp as barbed wire. "Listen, Ms. Langley, this isn't a game. These men have seen combat. They've bled in places you can't even pronounce. And you, what do you think you're doing here?" That was when something shifted. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't push back. She just said evenly, "If you could process my paperwork, I'd like to begin the evaluation." The audacity of it froze them for a second. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was something else, something harder to pin down. Richards leaned in, his voice low, venomous. "Fine, you want a taste. Sergeant, get her processed. Let's see how long our guest lasts." His grin widened. "Yes, sir." He turned to her with mock ceremony. "This way, ma'am, we'll get you all set up." The murmurs followed her. Smirks. Bets whispered under breaths. 10 minutes, one man said, 20 at most. But none of them noticed how steady her hands were as she signed the papers. How calm her breathing was as sneered about broken men and shattered pride. When she asked for a rifle, his grin turned wolfish. He handed her the MRAD.338, the beast of the arsenal, heavy and punishing. A weapon that chewed through rookies, shoulders, and egos in equal measure. "Think you can handle this, Ms. Langley?" he mocked. She took it, no struggle, no hesitation. Her hands moved across it like they had been there 100 times before. Check chamber, adjust scope, weight balanced. Every motion was muscle memory. And for the first time, his grin faltered. The others didn't see it yet, but he felt it, a flicker of doubt. Richards pointed to position 5, the hardest line on the range, where the desert sun cut like a knife and the winds twisted without warning. "Target at 2,796 meters, he called, loud enough for everyone to hear. His smirk was a blade. "Let's see how far that smile takes you." The murmur in the crowd was almost giddy. It wasn't a test, it was a setup. No one hit that shot cold, not on day one, not ever. But she didn't protest. She didn't flinch. She just nodded once, slinging the rifle with a quiet grace, and walked to position 5. By now every eye was on her. The laughter had softened into curiosity, though none would admit it. Even Richards, arms crossed, couldn't look away. She lay down, body flowing into position with textbook precision. Hands steady, breath slowing, face calm. General Harrison, watching from the command building, narrowed his eyes. He'd seen countless shooters prepare on that line. None of them moved like this. "Notice," called out loudly, trying to recover his audience. "At this distance, bullet drop exceeds 50 feet, drift over 20. Even the effect comes into play. That's why no one ever hits this shot without weeks of calibration. What you're watching is a guaranteed failure." But she didn't hear him, or maybe she did. Either way, her focus was absolute. The desert stilled, the wind dropped, silence stretched. Her finger curled against the trigger. The thundered, its recoil slamming into her shoulder. The sound rolled across the barren range like a storm. 1 second. 2. 3. Every man held his breath. And then, ping! Sharp, clean, impossible, the sound of steel struck dead center. For a heartbeat the range was frozen, eyes wide, mouths parted. It wasn't possible, not on the first shot, not at that distance. But the target technician's voice crackled through the radio, almost stumbling over his words. "Direct hit, center mass, perfect shot." She rose, calm, smooth, handing the back to as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No smirk, no gloat, just steady composure. And for the first time, Major Richards, who had spent 15 years tearing men apart, felt something shift in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years. Respect. But he didn't yet know who she was. None of them did. Not yet. Why didn't she look surprised? That was the first thought that ran through Major Richards' mind as the echo of the shot faded into silence. He'd seen men cry at this range. He'd seen the desert itself break them, heat shimmering, wind cutting, doubt eating through every nerve until even the strongest shooters collapsed. But this woman, this civilian in jeans and boots, stood up as though she had expected nothing less. No celebration, no shock, just calm. And that calm unsettled him more than the shot itself. For once had no words. His clipboard dangled from his fingers until it slipped, forgotten, into the dirt. His jaw clenched, but his eyes couldn't hide it, the disbelief, the small thread of fear twisting in his gut. The candidates whispered among themselves, the ripple moving like static through the formation. What the hell just happened? No way that was real. She hit it. Their voices weren't mocking anymore. They carried awe and something heavier, an unease none of them wanted to name. General Harrison, who had been silent at the edge of the field, began walking forward. His stride slow, purposeful, as though he had just witnessed something extraordinary and didn't want to break the spell too soon. Handed the rifle back to, the weapon resting in his arms like dead weight. He stared at her, words stuck in his throat. "That was quite a shot," General Harrison said, his voice calm but carrying across the stunned silence. She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." Her tone was level, no arrogance, no apology, just fact. Harrison studied her, eyes narrowing, searching her face. Something tugged at the edge of his memory. He extended his hand. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. General William Harrison." "Langley," she replied, shaking his hand with quiet firmness. The name hung in the air. To most of the men it meant nothing, just another civilian name. But to the general it sparked a recognition he couldn't quite place. His gaze sharpened. Richard stepped in, desperate to regain control of the spiraling scene. "General, this is irregular. She isn't on the roster. She has no—" "Langley," Harrison interrupted, ignoring him. His tone was slow, deliberate, testing the weight of the name. "Would that be Captain Langley?" The silence was immediate. No laughter this time, just the sharp intake of breath from a dozen throats. Richards froze, blinked, his face blanching. She didn't flinch, didn't deny it, only let the corner of her mouth twitch into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Yes, sir." And just like that, the room shifted. Captain, not civilian, not Ms., not Miss Captain Langley. The shock was almost physical. Richard's face went pale, as though the desert sun had drained the blood from him. The smirk he'd worn all morning evaporated, leaving only raw humiliation. One of the candidates, a grizzled sergeant with combat tour under his belt, spoke suddenly, his voice carrying clear across the hushed ranks. "Wait, Langley, are you—" He stopped, disbelief choking the words. Then louder, unable to contain it. "Are you the ghost?" The word cracked across the assembly like thunder. The ghost. The ghost of Kandahar. Stories whispered intense under foreign skis. Tales of a lone sniper who had covered a trapped squad for 3 days without rest, 32 kills in shifting mountain winds, each shot impossible, each one perfect. The sniper who was never seen, never missed, never identified. Every man there had heard the story. Most dismissed it as myth, a soldier's campfire legend, and every one of them had assumed, of course, that the ghost was a man, some faceless, bearded phantom from some classified unit. Said nothing, her silence was answer enough. The candidates stiffened, eyes wide. Instructors shifted, their arrogance collapsing under the weight of recognition. Muttered something under his breath as though trying to piece together fragments of other legends he'd heard. Arctic records, convoy rescues, names without names, all circling back, converging on the woman who stood before them in jeans and a ponytail. Harrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the gravity of revelation. He said, addressing them all but staring directly at Richards, "You are standing in the presence of one of the most accomplished snipers in modern history." Gasped, whispers, silence. He recited her record like it was etched in stone. The ghost of Kandahar, the Arctic record holder, the operator who had rewritten sniper doctrine with techniques still taught today, confirmed eliminations across 3 theaters, missions no one spoke of outside closed doors. And here she was, calm, steady, smiling as though none of it mattered. Richards felt sick. The ground seemed to tilt beneath him. The woman he had mocked, the coffee girl he had jeered at, the civilian he had humiliated in front of his men, she outranked him, she outclassed him, she every record he had ever clung to. The desert sun felt harsher now, the air heavier. General Harrison turned, his voice steel. "Major Richards, I believe you owe Major Langley an apology." The silence pressed in. Richards' throat bobbed as he swallowed. His voice came strained, brittle. "Major Langley, I offer my apologies for my conduct. There is no excuse for how you were treated upon arrival." Studied him, eyes unreadable. The men watched, breath caught, waiting for her to cut him down, to humiliate him as he had humiliated her. But she didn't. "Apology accepted," she said simply. Then her voice cooled, sharp as a blade. "I trust the rest of the evaluation will be conducted with professionalism." It wasn't a request, it was a command. Richard stiffened, nodded sharply. "Yes, ma'am." The weight of it settled on him like chains. And then Harrison dropped the final hammer. "She isn't here as a candidate," he said, his gaze sweeping the field. "She's here to evaluate the filter itself, its standards, its methods, and its instructors." The impact hit like a blast wave. Richard's kingdom crumbled in an instant. Every eye turned back to her. The woman who had walked in through the side gate with nothing but a backpack now held the authority to judge them all. The filter wasn't testing her. She was testing the filter. The murmurs rose, frantic and desperate. The candidates exchanged wide-eyed looks. The instructors stiffened, their past jeers replaying in their minds, each one a nail in their careers. Bent down to snatch up his dropped clipboard, his hands trembling. Downing fumbled with his notes, desperate to rewrite his role in the morning. Richard stood rigid, his humiliation complete. She just stood there, calm, silent, as if this had all been inevitable. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What happens when the predator becomes the teacher? The men of the filter didn't know how to answer that question yet. But the silence after the impossible shot still hung heavy over them, and no one dared move until General Harrison gave the order. He did not delay. His voice carried with the calm authority of a man who had seen enough to make decisions without hesitation. "Major Langley will be conducting a comprehensive evaluation of this facility. Effective immediately, she has full authority. Major Richards, you will serve as her executive officer until her report is complete." There it was, the fall of a kingdom. Richard's jaw tightened, but he obeyed. He had no choice. Every man present had witnessed the shift, the collapse of the old order. The filter was no longer his domain. It belonged to her. And Langley, calm, steady, unshaken, wasted no time. She turned, her eyes scanning the ranks of nervous candidates. These men had come expecting cruelty, humiliation, and the slow grind of breaking down. They had braced themselves for psychological warfare and sleepless nights, for being stripped of dignity until only instinct remained. Instead, they found her. "At ease," she said, her voice carrying clear but not harsh. The contrast from Richard's bark was striking. "You are here to be tested, to be pushed, to be sharpened, but not to be broken." Some of them blinked, uncertain if they'd heard correctly. "You will be judged fairly, blindly. No favoritism, no bias. Every shot, every movement, every decision will stand on its own merit. This place isn't about who can survive being humiliated. It's about who can adapt under pressure, who can perform when the world tilts against them." Her gaze swept over them, steady and searching. "That is what keeps men alive in combat. That is what matters here." The words landed like stones dropped into water, rippling outward. A few candidates straightened, their jaws tightening with renewed determination. Others looked uncertain, torn between relief and suspicion. The instructors, however, shifted uneasily. Years of tradition, their entire philosophy of breaking men to see who crawled back up, it was being rewritten in a single morning. His face burned red, though whether from shame or anger no one could tell. Downing scribbled furiously on his clipboard, as if hiding behind paper could erase the memory of his mockery. And Richards, he stood stiff, the sting of humiliation still raw, his authority gone, his methods dismantled, his pride in ashes. But spared him no gloat, no vengeance. She simply moved forward, inspecting rifles, asking precise questions about calibration, watching the way candidates set their stance. She made notes, silent, professional. Her authority was not loud, it was absolute. By mid-morning, she had already rewritten the first trial. No shouting, no theatrics. Each candidate would be scored without the evaluators knowing whose work they were assessing. Targets tagged only with numbers. Feedback written, specific, and constructive, not a word of cruelty allowed. Your job, she told them, is not to destroy potential, it is to uncover it. Some bristled. The grizzled master sergeant spoke up. With respect, ma'am, our standards keep this place elite. If we lower them. We're not lowering standards, she interrupted calmly but firmly. We're redefining them. Ask yourself, how many great shooters have you lost because you were too busy trying to prove you could break them? How many men who could have been legends walked out that gate in shame, not because they lacked skill, but because this place mistook cruelty for rigor? Her words struck deeper than any shout could have, said nothing more. By noon, the entire tone of the filter had shifted. Candidates still sweated, still struggled, still fought against exhaustion and pressure. But their eyes were different. Where once there was dread, now there was purpose. And the instructors, they found themselves uneasy under her gaze. Every careless word, every gesture of disdain, they cut it off before it left their lips. The woman they had mocked now held their futures in her hands. The desert heat bore down. Wind swept grit across the range. But something else pressed heavier on them all, the awareness that they were being judged not just on how they performed, but on who they were. That afternoon, a small moment revealed the depth of her approach. Staff Sergeant Miller, one of the younger candidates, fumbled a wind calculation during his trial. His bullet drifted wide, missing by more than 2 feet. Under Richards, the mistake would have been met with ridicule, a sharp reminder of failure designed to eat at the man's confidence. Instead, approached quietly, kneeling beside him. "Tell me what you saw," she said. Miller swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his temple. I thought the wind had dropped, ma'am." She nodded. "It shifted, faster than you read it. That's not failure, that's environment. Adjust here, try again." Her tone wasn't soft. It was steady, exact, clinical. She didn't coddle, she corrected. And when his next shot found its mark, his eyes lit with something that hadn't been seen at the filter in years. Confidence. General Harrison, watching from a distance, leaned toward Richards. His voice was low, deliberate. "Do you see it?" Richards' face was rigid, but his voice betrayed the crack. "Yes, sir." Harrison nodded. This is what the filter should have been all along. The day closed with the sun bleeding across the Nevada sky, staining the desert orange and red. Candidates dragged themselves from the field, exhausted but not broken. Instructors filed reports with uncharacteristic care, knowing every word might be weighed against them. And she stood at the edge of the range, eyes on the farthest target, where she had fired the impossible shot that morning. The place was different now. The men knew it, she knew it, even Richards knew it. But change was never clean. And the question lingered in every mind as night fell. Could the filter, this place built on breaking, truly be remade by someone who refused to break? What spreads faster than fire in a dry desert? Rumors. By the second morning, the filter was buzzing with them. The candidates whispered her name in the barracks, her impossible shot repeated in hushed tones like a ghost story come alive. Instructors avoided eye contact in the mess hall. Every laugh or careless remark now weighed against the memory of who she was. Langley, the ghost of Kandahar, the woman who had walked through their gate like a civilian and shattered the strongest myth this place had built, its myth of invincibility. Some refused to believe it. "It was luck," one candidate muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "No one makes that shot cold." "Luck doesn't steady your hands like that," another answered. "Luck doesn't move like she moved." And then there were the veterans, the ones who had heard the stories in country, the ones who had felt their squads lifted out of the jaws of death by an unseen hand. They didn't laugh. They just nodded quietly, eyes heavy with the weight of recognition. By the filter's routines had bent to her presence. Instructors who once barked insults now delivered their critiques carefully, their words sharpened into precision rather than cruelty. Richards walked the line with stiff formality, his humiliation still fresh, his pride bleeding into the dirt he once owned. Once sneering, now carried her requests with an almost painful eagerness, hoping his compliance might rewrite the memory of his mockery. Said little, she didn't need to. Her silence was louder than their noise. The second day's evaluations were. Candidates lined up at the range, each preparing for a trial meant to stretch them to breaking. Sweat stung their eyes, their muscles burned, but there was something different in the air. They wanted to prove themselves to her. One lieutenant, barely 30, adjusted his stance under her watchful eye. His jaw clenched, but his hands trembled on the scope. She crouched beside him, her voice low enough only he could hear. "You're breathing," she said. He swallowed hard. "Too fast, ma'am." "Too shallow. You're trying to hide the shake. Don't breathe into it. Let it move through you." Her words weren't poetry. They were instruction, direct, usable, alive. The lieutenant exhaled, steadied, and when his shot rang out, the target pinged. He looked up at her like a child waiting for approval from a parent. She didn't smile, she didn't praise, she only nodded once, and somehow that was more than enough. From the command building, General Harrison watched. His arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but in his silence there was satisfaction. Richard stood beside him, his eyes locked on her, his face tightening with each display of effortless authority. "She isn't breaking them," Harrison said finally. Richard stiffened. "No, sir. She's building them." The words landed heavier than gunfire. Richards wanted to argue, to cling to the methods that had defined his career, but he couldn't. Not when the results were already clear. Candidates who would have wilted under his scorn now stood taller, sharper, their confidence honed instead of crushed. That afternoon walked the obstacle course with the candidates, not to participate, though every man there knew she could have, but to observe. She made notes, asked questions, spoke to them individually as though each one mattered. To one soldier who stumbled on the third wall, she said simply, "Your arms are stronger than your legs. Change your grip. Let your core carry you." He tried again, cleared it, looked back at her with breathless gratitude. To another who hesitated at the rope, she said, "You don't need to climb faster. You need to climb smarter. Count your rhythm. Anchor, pull." He followed, made it. She didn't cheer, didn't soften. She simply redirected them, nudged them. And with each correction, the filter itself seemed to shift, as though the desert air had changed. By evening, whispers of her true identity had reached every corner of the facility. The younger men asked the older ones for confirmation. "Is it true? Is she the ghost?" The older ones gave the same answer every time. A shrug, a look, silence. But their silence spoke louder than words. Once sneering approached her near sundown. His voice was lower than the day before, his tone stripped of sarcasm. "Ma'am," he began awkwardly, "about yesterday." Looked at him steady, waiting. Swallowed, his pride catching in his throat. "I was out of line. I didn't know who you were." Her expression didn't change. Her voice was even. "And if I had been no one?" The question cut deeper than any reprimand. Flinched, his eyes dropping to the ground. She didn't press, didn't scold. She simply turned away, her silence carrying more weight than judgment. That night the candidates lay awake in the barracks, the desert winds howling outside. Some whispered still, but most were silent, their thoughts tangled. Who was she, really? What else had she done? And more importantly, what would she demand of them tomorrow? The filter was changing. They could all feel it. But change is never easy, never bloodless. And as the stars burned cold above the Nevada desert, one truth gnawed at them all. The real test hadn't even begun. What happens when a kingdom refuses to die? By the fifth sunrise over the filter, the desert air felt different. The sun still burned. The wind still cut. The sand still swallowed every careless step. But under it all was something new, an unease that came not from the land but from the men. Change had arrived, and not everyone was willing to surrender. The candidates felt it first. They had come expecting to be broken, humiliated, torn apart until only fragments remained. Instead, they found themselves sharpened, guided, measured not by cruelty but by precision. Langley demanded the impossible, but she gave them the tools to reach it. For the first time, they left the range each day exhausted but unbroken, bruised, blistered, but standing taller than when they'd arrived. It unsettled them. It thrilled them. It made them believe they might actually become more than survivors. But the instructors, men who had built their authority on fear and failure, faced a different reality. Each correction made, each rule she rewrote, chipped away at the foundation they had built their careers on. Some, had begun to bend, to see, to question. Others clenched to the old ways. Richards most of all. He wore his professionalism like armor, but beneath it, his pride seethed. He watched her walk the lines with calm authority, watched the men respond to her presence with respect he had never commanded without fear. And each nod, each shot fired under her eye, drove the knife deeper. By midday, the resistance began to surface, subtle at first. An instructor dragging his feet on her directives, a report misplaced, a target adjustment made late, forcing candidates to stumble. Nothing blatant, nothing she could call outright sabotage, but enough to send the message. Some men were not ready to surrender their kingdom. Noticed, of course she did. She said nothing. She only watched, taking notes with the same calm precision she gave everything. But when she addressed the candidates that evening, her voice carried steel. "Some of you still believe this place is about survival," she said, standing at the edge of the range as the sun bled into the horizon. "You're wrong. Survival is instinct. Any animal can survive. You are here to master something greater: discipline, precision, adaptability. That is what keeps you alive when survival isn't enough." The men stood silent, the weight of her words pressing down. Behind them, the instructors shifted uneasily, some refusing to meet her eyes. General Harrison, standing nearby, caught Richard's glance. The older man's voice was low but sharp. "You're losing them, and you know it." Richard's jaw tightened. "They respect her because she's a legend. It won't last." Harrison's reply was quiet, but it cut deeper than any shout. "No, they respect her because she's right." That night in the instructor's quarters, the unease boiled over. Sat rigid at the table, his usual smirk gone, replaced by restless fingers tapping wood. Downing muttered curses under his breath, his pride raw. Richard stood, his shadow long against the wall. "She's dismantling this place," Downing said bitterly, "turning it into some training seminar." "No," said, surprising them both. His voice was low, conflicted. "She's making it better. You've seen the scores, you've seen the candidates." Downing sneered. "You're just trying to cover your ass. You think siding with her will save your career." Richards lifted a hand, silencing them. His voice was heavy, controlled, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. "This is still my facility, my command. She won't be here forever." But even as he said it, the words tasted hollow, because in his gut he knew this wasn't temporary. This was transformation, and transformations don't ask permission. The next morning the test came. Ordered a new drill. Blind evaluations at extreme range, scored without knowing whose shots were whose. No names, no reputations, only results. The candidates accepted it without question. The instructors bristled. "This isn't how it's done," one muttered, too low for most to hear. But she heard. Her gaze landed on him, calm, unflinching. "Then perhaps how it's done is the problem." The words silenced him, silenced them all. As the drill began, a tension hung in the air thicker than the desert dust. Shots cracked across the range, echoes rolling against the mountains. Candidates adjusted, sweated, fought to steady trembling hands. And moved among them, silent, precise, her presence both comfort and pressure. By the end, when the targets were marked and the results laid bare, the truth stood undeniable. The men who had been dismissed early under the old system now rose near the top. The favorites, the loudest, faltered. Adaptability had beaten arrogance, and the filter itself had changed. That evening, Richard stood alone at the far edge of the range, staring at the horizon where the last light faded. His hands clenched behind his back, his chest heavy with something he had never known before. Doubt. The desert wind carried the echo of her shot from days earlier, still ringing in his mind. That impossible shot that had toppled everything. He hated it, he respected it, he feared it. And for the first time in 15 years, Major Richards realized he was no longer the predator here. What happens when silence is no longer enough? By the 6th day, the filter's transformation was undeniable. Candidates who had entered braced for humiliation now carried themselves with a quiet confidence. Their shots were sharper, their movements more precise. The fear that once shadowed every step had given way to something rare in this place: belief. But belief breeds tension. For every candidate who grew under Langley's guidance, there was an instructor who felt his authority shrinking. For every success recorded under her system, another tradition cracked and fell away. And with each passing hour, the resentment deepened. It broke that morning. The sun was merciless, the heat shimmering off the desert floor. The range was alive with rifle fire, the cadence of shots echoing like heartbeats. Moved among the candidates, her eyes sharp, her words few but exact. Slow your exhale. Trust your first read. Anchor your elbows. Don't fight the recoil, ride it. Every correction hit its mark. Every candidate leaned into her presence like steel drawn to a magnet. And then Sargent stepped forward. The grizzled veteran had swallowed his doubts all week, watching as her methods reshaped the filter. But something in him, pride, tradition, maybe fear, snapped. His voice cut across the line, louder than hers, sharp enough to jolt the men. This isn't how we do it. The range stilled. Candidates froze mid-aim. Even the wind seemed to pause. Turned slowly, her expression calm. Sergeant squared his shoulders, his voice rising. This place was built to break men, to strip them down and see who can stand when nothing's left. That's how you find the best, not with notebooks, not with blind scoring, with fire, with pressure, with pain. His words carried weight, years of authority, the kind of conviction that had once ruled this place. Some of the candidates shifted uncertainly, torn between old power and new. Didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice. She only let the silence stretch until it pressed on every chest. Then quietly, "And how many did you lose, Sergeant?" Blinked to watch. Her eyes held his, unyielding. How many men, good men, walked out of that gate because you mistook cruelty for strength? How many names never reached their potential because this place broke them instead of building them? The words cut deep, deeper than a shout ever could. For a moment faltered, his jaw clenched, his fists tightened, but no answer came. Stepped closer, her voice steady, measured. Excellence isn't born from humiliation. It's forged in discipline, precision, focus. You don't create warriors by destroying them, you create ghosts, shadows of what they could have been. Her gaze swept the line. Her words meant not only for him, but for every man listening. If you believe the only way to prove strength is to break others, then you've forgotten what strength really is. The silence that followed was heavy. The candidates stared, caught between awe and fear, while the instructors shifted uneasily. Finally exhaled, the fight leaving him like air from a punctured tire. He gave a stiff nod, his voice low. "Yes, ma'am." The confrontation ended, but the echo of it lingered. Later, Richards found her at the edge of the range, her eyes on the distant horizon. His face was unreadable, but his voice was softer than it had been all week. "You broke him," Richards said. She shook her head. "No," I reminded him. "Of what?" "That this place was never about us. It was about them." She gestured toward the candidates who were back at their rifles, steadier now, more determined than before. Richard studied her profile, the sun casting long shadows across her face. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own methods pressing down on him. "They won't forgive us," he said quietly, "for how we treated them." His eyes never left the horizon. "They don't need to, they just need to be better than us." The wind picked up then, carrying the smell of dust and sweat across the range. Stood among the candidates, his posture rigid but his voice softer, his corrections more precise. The resistance had cracked. But not all of it. In the instructor's quarters that night, Downing slammed his fist against the table. "She humiliated in front of everyone. Richards, are we really going to let this stand? Are we going to watch her dismantle everything we built?" Richards said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Downing leaned in, his voice low, sharp. "If we don't push back now, it's over. She'll rewrite this place in her image, and we'll be footnotes." Across the room, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward the door as though afraid she might walk in at any moment. "She already has," he said quietly. The room fell silent. And for the first time, Richards felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The desert outside whispered with the wind. Change had come. It was no longer a question of if, only of how much more it would take. What does a man do when the ground beneath him is no longer his? By the seventh day, Major Richards felt like a ghost in his own kingdom. The filter no longer moved to his cadence. Orders he would have barked now came softer, sharper from her. The candidates looked past him, their eyes fixed on Langley as though she carried gravity itself. And maybe she did. Everywhere Richards turned, he saw her fingerprints. Targets marked with precision he hadn't considered. Reports rewritten in her hand, the cold cruelty stripped out, replaced with notes that actually taught. Even, who had once sneered at her every step, now leaned in close when she spoke, scribbling her words as though they were gospel. It should have infuriated Richards, and it did, but beneath the anger lay something worse. Doubt. That morning the candidates gathered for a stress drill, a brutal test of endurance, precision, and decision-making under exhaustion. Under his system, the drill was designed to break them, to strip away everything but instinct. Today, it unfolded differently. Oversaw it herself. Her instructions were calm, measured. The candidates stumbled, sweated, faltered, but where Richards would have torn them apart for every mistake, she corrected, redirected, pushed them harder not with humiliation but with clarity. And damn it, she was right. Their shots tightened, their reactions sharpened. By the end, the group stood not broken but standing taller, their exhaustion carried with pride instead of shame. Richards watched from the edge, his chest tight. For years he had sworn the filter's cruelty was necessary, that it forged warriors, but the proof was in front of him now, undeniable. Her way worked. And it left him hollow. When the drill ended, walked the line, her eyes sharp as ever. One candidate, Private Wilson, young, raw, eager, caught her attention. He had missed 3 consecutive shots at mid-range, his hands trembling with frustration. Richards braced himself for her correction, expecting her to dismantle him. Instead, she crouched, her voice steady. "You're chasing the shot," she said quietly. Wilson blinked. "Ma'am. You're thinking about the last miss. Forget it. The bullet's gone. The only one that matters is the one in your chamber right now." The private nodded, steadied, fired. The target rang. His relief was visible, his shoulders sagging with something like gratitude. Rose moved on, leaving behind not humiliation but hope. Richards turned away, his throat tight. That evening, the desert was painted in bruised purples and fatting gold. The candidates ate in silence, their exhaustion tempered by quiet satisfaction. Instructors lingered on the edges, their once arrogant postures softened by the week's weight. Richard sat alone, his meal untouched. It was General Harrison who found him. The older man's shadow stretched long across the mess hall floor as he stopped at Richard's table. "You look like a man fighting himself," Harrison said, his tone not unkind. Richard's jaw clenched. "I built this place." "You built a cage," Harrison said evenly. "She's turned it into a forge." Richard's fists tightened. "You think I didn't care about results. You think I didn't want the best." "I think you mistook fear for strength," Harrison said, then softer, leaning closer. "And maybe you were afraid yourself." The words landed like a blow. Richards looked away, his chest heavy. For years he had hidden behind cruelty, convinced it was necessity. But now, with every passing hour under her command, the truth gnawed at him. Maybe he had been wrong. Later that night, Richards found himself walking the range alone. The desert was silent, the target's ghostly shadows in the moonlight. He stopped at position 5, the spot where it had all begun, where she had fired the impossible shot that shattered everything. He stared at the empty stand, the memory replaying in his mind. Her calm, her silence, the way the world had paused just before the ping of steel. It wasn't luck, he knew that now. It was mastery, years of it, more than he had ever known. And as he stood there, alone in the desert night, Richards felt the truth settle on him like the weight of the sky. He had spent his life building walls. She had spent hers breaking through them. And in one shot, she had proven what he had never dared to admit. Strength was not measured by how many you broke. It was measured by how many you lifted. The next morning, when walked the range, Richards was already there. His posture was stiff, but his voice, when it came, was different. "Major Langley," he said, his tone carrying none of the mockery it once had. "Your modifications to the stress drill, they improved performance across the board." She studied him, her eyes unreadable. He forced himself to continue. "I resisted your methods. I thought they would weaken this place, but I see now they've made it stronger." It cost him everything to say it, his pride, his armor, his kingdom. But for the first time in years, his words felt honest. Nodded once, her face calm. "The measure of a leader isn't never being wrong, Major. It's what he does when he realizes he is." Her words weren't sharp, they weren't cruel, but they cut deeper than any reprimand. And Richards knew this was his moment of choice. Cling to the old ways, or step into the new. The desert wind picked up, carrying dust across the range, whispering through the silence. Richards closed his eyes, exhaled, and for the first time in 15 years, let go of the need to be king. When he opened them, the filter was no longer his. It was theirs. What happens when the storm leaves, but the ground is forever changed. The 8th day dawned cold over the Nevada desert, the kind of chill that came not from weather but from silence. The filter was quieter than it had been in years. No barking insults, no manufactured cruelty, just the sound of boots in the sand, rifles on steel, breath steady and measured. The place was different now, everyone felt it. The candidates moved with a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. They had endured something more brutal than humiliation, accountability, had not allowed excuses, not tolerated laziness, not softened the weight of their failure. But where the old system had left them crawling in shame, she left them standing taller, carrying the knowledge of how to be better. Some of them would not make the cut. That truth had not changed. But even those who fell short walked with dignity. And dignity was something this place had never given before. For the instructors, the change was harder to swallow. Downing avoided her gaze entirely, his pride cracked but not shattered, still clinging to the ruins of the old order. Once eager to mock, now lingered near her like a man desperate to learn, scribbling notes that might one day save his career. And Richards was different. The man who had ruled this desert with arrogance now carried himself with a heavy, quiet humility. He no longer barked orders. He no longer bristled when the candidates looked to her instead of him. He moved through the range like a man who had been broken, but in the breaking, found something he hadn't known he'd lost. Perspective. That morning called the candidates together one last time. The desert wind tugged at her hair, the sun sharp against her face. She stood tall, her hands behind her back, her voice calm but carrying. You came here believing strength was about surviving cruelty. You were wrong. Strength is not in how much pain you can endure, but in how well you can adapt when everything around you changes. That is what war demands. That is what life demands. And that is what will decide who among you is ready. Her words cut through the silence. No theatrics, no false inspiration, just truth. She paused, scanning their faces, letting the weight settle. Some of you will leave here today. Some will stay. But remember this. The measure of your worth is not written by the filter. It is written by the choices you make when no one is watching. Don't let anyone take that from you, not even me. The men stood silent, their eyes fixed on her, the truth of her words sinking deep. Later in the command office, General Harrison reviewed her notes. His eyes moved slowly over the pages, the detail, the precision, the unflinching honesty. Finally, he set them down and looked at her. "You've changed this place," he said simply. Shook her head. "No, they changed, I just gave them the chance." Harrison studied her a long moment, then smiled faintly. "And what about you? You came here with no fanfare, no orders, no need. Why?" Her eyes softened, just for a breath. "Because once I watched too many men walk out of gates like this believing they were worthless. I couldn't let that stand." The general nodded but said nothing more. He didn't need to. When she left the office, Richards was waiting outside. His posture was rigid, but his eyes carried none of the arrogance of before, only humility. "Major Langley," he said, his voice low, "you've shown me more than I wanted to see, more than I was ready to. I don't know what to do with it yet, but I'll try." For the first time, she allowed a small smile. That's all any of us can do. She walked past him then, her boots crunching in the dirt, the desert wind pulling at her jacket. The candidates straightened as she passed, their eyes following her like shadows chasing light. Not because she demanded it, not because she asked, but because she had earned it. She reached the gate with nothing more than the backpack she had walked in with. No ceremony, no applause, no farewell. The filter would go on without her, but it would never be the same. As the sun dipped low, the last sound was the steady ping of rifles striking steel, sharper than before, truer. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of her impossible shot still lingered, as though the desert itself refused to forget. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.